What if the man laughing with the police over a beer was the very killer they were hunting? Not a suspect. Not a person of interest. But the murderer himself, sitting just a few feet away from those sworn to stop him. This is the story of Ed Kemper, the towering figure known to his friends as Big Ed. A man who charmed detectives, earned their trust, and then shattered everything they believed they knew. In the early 1970s, Santa Cruz, California, was a small community with a dark undercurrent. A place where hitchhikers roamed the highways and neighbors greeted each other warmly. But beneath that surface, terror was quietly taking hold. Women were disappearing without a trace. Bodies were being discovered in secluded locations. The panic grew, but the clues were few. And as investigators raced against time to find a killer, they unknowingly shared drinks, stories, and laughs with him at a local bar called the Jury Room. Ed Kemper was no ordinary man. At 6 feet 9 inches tall and weighing over 250 pounds, his presence alone was enough to command attention. But it wasn't just his size that drew people in. He was charming, articulate, and quick with a man who seemed harmless, even endearing, to those around him. In fact, the officers at the jury room called him their friend. They trusted him, confided in him, and never for a moment imagined what he was capable of. Kemper's double life came to light in April of 1973, when he placed a phone call to the police that would forever change their understanding of the man they thought they knew. At first, they laughed, dismissing it as one of his many jokes. But this time, Kemper wasn't joking. He confessed to a string of gruesome murders, including the killing of his own mother. The officers were stunned. How could they have missed it? How could they have let him slip so easily under their radar? This is not just a story about a man who killed. It's a story about deception, manipulation, and a shocking breach of trust. How could someone like Ed Kemper hide his crimes in plain sight? What did he say, what did he do to ensure that no one would ever suspect him? Over the next 2 hours, we'll uncover the unsettling details of his life, his crimes, and the chilling moment when he decided to come clean. This is the story of Ed Kemper, the man who turned friendship into a weapon, and left a trail of devastation in his wake. To understand the man who would later call himself a walking time bomb, we must go back to where it all began. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California. The second of 3 children, he grew up in a home filled with tension, anger, and fear. His parents' volatile marriage ended when he was 9 years old, leaving him to live with his mother, Clarnell Strandberg, a woman he would later describe as the root of all his hatred. Clarnell, by all accounts, was domineering and emotionally abusive. She would belittle Ed constantly, calling him worthless and incapable of being loved. She forced him to sleep in the basement, claiming he was a danger to his sisters. Alone in the dark, Ed's mind began to twist. He developed a fascination with death and power, starting with small animals, dissecting them to understand their inner workings. By his early teens, Kemper's fantasies grew darker. At age 15, he ran away to live with his father, only to be rejected and sent back to his mother. Feeling abandoned by both parents, Kemper began to internalize his anger. And then, in 1964, he acted on it. At 15, Kemper shot his grandmother during an argument and then killed his grandfather when he returned home, fearing his reaction. When questioned, he calmly told authorities, "I just wanted to see what it felt like to kill Grandma." These words sent shockwaves through the community, but for psychiatrists, they were a chilling confirmation of his psychological instability. Kemper was sent to the Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for the criminally insane. Here, he became a model inmate. He impressed doctors with his intelligence, scoring an IQ of 145, and even earned a role administering psychological tests to other patients. But behind the facade of cooperation, Kemper was learning how to manipulate the system. He knew what to say, how to act, and when to play the part of a rehabilitated young man. In 1969, after just 5 years, Kemper was released at the age of 21. His doctors deemed him no longer a threat to society. He returned to live with his mother in Santa Cruz, a decision that would later prove fatal for many. But what society didn't know was that the young man they thought had turned his life around was planning something far more horrifying. Santa Cruz, California. Known for its picturesque coastline, vibrant boardwalk, and tight-knit community. In the early 1970s, it seemed like the perfect place to live. But behind the idyllic scenery, something unthinkable was happening. Between 1970 and 1973, Santa Cruz was plagued by a series of violent murders. Women, many of them hitchhikers, began disappearing. Their bodies would later be discovered in remote locations, often mutilated beyond recognition. The local newspapers dubbed it the murder capital of the world. By 1972, fear gripped the town. Parents warned their daughters to avoid hitchhiking, but for many, it was an essential part of daily life. Cars were expensive, and hitchhiking was considered a practical and relatively safe way to get around. No one could have imagined the danger that awaited them. As the community searched for answers, the Santa Cruz police were stretched thin. They were already dealing with another killer, Herbert Mullen, whose spree left 13 people dead. With so many murders happening simultaneously, investigators struggled to connect the dots. But amidst this chaos, a man named Ed Kemper stood unnoticed, blending into the fabric of everyday life. Kemper frequented the jury room, a local hangout for police officers. He listened carefully to their conversations, gathering details about the ongoing investigations. To the officers, he was just Big Ed, the friendly giant who loved to talk shop. But in reality, he was hiding secrets that would shake the very foundation of their trust. Little did the townspeople know that one of the men enjoying a drink at their local bar was also behind the city's growing fear. In the early 1970s, the roads around Santa Cruz were alive with the comings and goings of students, drifters, and hitchhikers. For most, a ride was an act of kindness, one that brought strangers together, if only for a brief moment. But for Edmund Kemper, those roads were hunting grounds. Kemper had a method. He drove a 1969 Ford Galaxy, a large, nondescript car that didn't attract attention. On the surface, he was polite, even friendly, offering rides to young women who were alone and vulnerable. At 6 feet 9 inches tall, he was an imposing figure, but his charm and intelligence put his victims at ease. He would engage them in casual conversation, discussing school, work, or their plans for the day. But behind the friendly facade, Kemper was calculating. Kemper specifically chose women who reminded him of the people he resented most, those he perceived as judgmental, dismissive, or controlling, much like his own mother. Once his victims were in the car, he would drive to secluded locations under the pretense of needing directions or taking a shortcut. By the time they realized something was wrong, it was too late. His first known victims were Mary Ann Pesse and Anita Luchessa, two 18-year-old college students hitchhiking to Stanford University. Kemper picked them up on May 7, 1972. They thought they were heading to their destination safely. Instead, he drove them to a remote wooded area. There, Kemper revealed his true nature. Using his size and strength, he overpowered them. What followed was unspeakable. After killing both women, he dismembered their bodies and disposed of the remains in separate locations, ensuring they would not be easily connected. It was a pattern he would repeat again and again. Kemper became adept at avoiding suspicion. He kept souvenirs, items belonging to his victims that he would later use to relieve the crimes. He also had a chilling routine. After committing the murders, he would return to the jury room, laughing and joking with the very officers who were investigating the disappearances. The officers nicknamed him Big Ed, a gentle giant they considered a friend. He used this camaraderie to his advantage, staying one step ahead of their investigations. They never suspected that the man they shared drinks with was also the one responsible for the bodies turning up across the county. Each time, Kemper refined his methods. He became more calculated, more deliberate. His victims included students, hitchhikers, and, ultimately, someone much closer to him. Despite the growing number of disappearances, Kemper remained invisible to law enforcement. He was a predator hiding in plain sight, his confidence growing with every kill. Each time, he evaded suspicion, leaving no one the wiser about the predator in their midst. But the worst was yet to come. In the heart of Santa Cruz, the jury room was more than just a bar. It was a gathering place for local law enforcement officers who worked tirelessly to solve the mystery behind the growing number of unsolved murders. A place to unwind after a day of investigating cases that seemed to go nowhere. One man who frequented the jury room was Ed Kemper. At 6 feet 9 inches, with a gentle demeanor and an intellect that often surpassed those around him, he easily became a fixture at the bar. Known as Big Ed, he didn't stand out in any way that would raise suspicion. He was friendly, always smiling, eager to join in conversations about the cases that consumed the local police force. And, most disconcertingly, he was always there. Though Santa Cruz was in the midst of a terrifying wave of disappearances and murders, there was no urgency in the air when Big Ed was around. He wasn't just another local, he was a trusted confidant, an easy companion for the officers. His disarming charm, combined with his unnerving intelligence, made him a man they thought they could trust. Conversations flowed easily. He spoke candidly about his own experiences with law enforcement, telling stories about his time in Atascadero State Hospital where he had spent years locked up for the brutal killings of his grandparents, a crime he had committed when he was just 15. His past was both unsettling and oddly reassuring to the officers. After all, Here was a man who had been declared rehabilitated, a man who was considered safe by the psychiatric community. And so, over time, they treated him as just another local, as if the monstrous acts of his past had never occurred. But all the while, Kemper was listening, absorbing every detail about the ongoing investigation. As they racked their brains over every new clue, every possible lead, Kemper remained just out of their reach. He was clever, always staying a few steps ahead. He was not just an observer, he was part of the conversation, feeding information to the officers as though he were one of them, providing them with the comfort of normalcy. His presence in the bar was a regular thing, a fact that would prove far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. We were all there together, talking about the case. I mean, he was right there. We even joked about the fact that the killer must be someone who could blend in, you know. He didn't seem to fit that profile, and none of us even thought to look at him. He was part of the group. The detective, seasoned, sharp, and trained to detect even the smallest signs of guilt, had no idea. The killer was sitting across from them, and no one had the faintest idea. While the investigators struggled to connect the dots, Kemper continued to evade suspicion. He was, in his mind, untouchable. He had become the very person he studied so carefully, someone who could manipulate and charm even the most seasoned detectives into overlooking the obvious. Week after week, Ed Kemper spent his evenings in the jury room, listening to theories, offering his own ideas, and gradually gaining the trust of those investigating the cases. He was part of their inner circle. It was a perfect cover for a man who knew how to hide in plain sight. But as the number of victims continued to rise, the authorities were closing in on the truth, though no one, not even the most experienced officers, had connected the dots. Every time a new body was found, Kemper felt a growing sense of power. He had evaded suspicion yet again, fooling the very people tasked with catching him. But as the police grew more desperate, the net began to tighten. As the investigation reached a boiling point, one thing became certain: someone in the room was hiding a deadly secret. But would they uncover the truth before it was too late? It was April 1973 when Ed Kemper finally decided to confess to the brutal murders he had committed over the past year. But what led him to this moment? What drove him to reveal the truth, knowing it would change everything? Until this point, Kemper had played the role of the charming local, the friendly giant who befriended the very officers who were investigating the murders he had committed. But something had changed. A new darkness had taken root inside him, something that would push him to the brink. On the night of April 20th, 1973, Kemper took a step that no one could have anticipated. He made a phone call to the Santa Cruz police, saying he wanted to confess to the murders. His voice was eerily calm as he told the officers that he had killed his mother, along with her friend, 59-year-old Sarah Taylor. He then promised to tell them everything. But the officers, still unable to believe what they were hearing, initially brushed it off as a joke. When he first called, "We thought he was just messing around, you know. I mean, it was just so unbelievable." But then he kept talking, and it started to sink in: he was serious. When Kemper finally arrived at the police station, his demeanor was unsettlingly calm. The detectives who had known him for months now sat in front of him, their eyes narrowing as he began to speak. His confession was methodical, as if recounting the events of the past year with a certain clinical detachment. He started with his mother, the woman who had been the source of his torment for most of his life. After years of emotional abuse and manipulation, he snapped. On that fateful night, he strangled her to death with a cord, then decapitated her body. But he didn't stop there. He kept his mother's severed head, using it as a grotesque form of revenge, reliving their painful history together. To him, it was the ultimate way to assert control over a woman who had kept him powerless for so long. After killing his mother, Kemper's rage was not satisfied. He turned to her friend, Sarah Taylor. She was an innocent bystander, but her life was taken just the same, in a brutal act of senseless violence. Kemper then moved on to his final step, calling the police and offering his confession. The police, still incredulous, could hardly believe what they were hearing. Kemper's detailed recounting of the murders left the detectives speechless. He spoke of how he killed his victims, dismembered their bodies, and disposed of their remains with frightening precision. He offered macabre details, telling them exactly how he lured each of his victims into his car, how he dominated them, and how he disposed of the evidence. There was no remorse, no hesitation, just cold, calculated facts. It was as though he was reading from a script, recounting events as if they had no personal significance to him whatsoever. Each confession was more chilling than the last. He didn't hold back, offering horrific details about his methods. He spoke of decapitation, of keeping severed heads, and of the sickening pleasure he derived from exerting total control over his victims. There was something almost matter-of-fact in his delivery, as if these were just another series of events he had orchestrated and controlled. As the confession unfolded, the detectives began to realize the full scale of the horrors Kemper had committed. What began as disbelief turned into shock, and soon the gruesome nature of the crimes was undeniable. But even as the officers sat in stunned silence, one question remained: why did he confess? When he said it, it didn't seem real. We didn't know what to believe. How could we have missed it? How did we not see it? He was always right there. But why did he confess? What drove him to finally reveal the truth? Was it guilt? A need for recognition? Or was it something far darker? After months of investigations, confessions, and mounting horror, Ed Kemper's trial began. The world was eager to see justice served, but in the courtroom, a different side of the killer was about to emerge, one that left everyone questioning how someone so monstrous could seem so ordinary. The trial of Ed Kemper began in the summer of 1973, and it didn't take long for his lack of remorse to become apparent. Sitting there in court, Kemper exuded a chilling calm. His demeanor was calm, almost detached, as he listened to the charges against him, the murders of 6 women and 2 men, all detailed in painstaking fashion. As the evidence mounted against him, the world began to understand just how cold-hearted he truly was. The prosecution painted a horrifying picture of a man who had lured innocent women to their deaths, systematically picking them up as hitchhikers before overpowering them. But what was truly chilling was not just the brutality of his crimes, but the cold, calculated way he approached them. This was not the work of a man driven by rage alone, no, This was the work of a predator who had honed his ability to manipulate, deceive, and control his victims with chilling precision. Despite the monstrous acts he had committed, Ed Kemper's intelligence seemed to be the one thing that left an indelible mark on the courtroom. His IQ, measured at a staggering 145, made him a man far more dangerous than the average killer. It wasn't just the ability to murder, it was his capacity to manipulate, to use his intellect to charm, disarm, and deceive everyone around him, even the police. Kemper's IQ was not just a number, it was his weapon. He had used it to manipulate people, to disguise the predator lurking within. From his childhood, where he had shown early signs of being a social outcast, to his later interactions with law enforcement, his intelligence allowed him to remain invisible. His ability to blend into the background, to charm those around him, made him a master of deception. But in the courtroom, his intelligence would become a double-edged sword. It was clear that Kemper understood the weight of his actions. He knew exactly what he had done, and he was aware of the consequences. And yet, despite this understanding, there was no remorse. No empathy for the victims he had so coldly taken from the world. No hint of guilt. As the trial proceeded, the focus shifted not just to the grisly details of the murders but to the man sitting in front of them. A man who, despite the overwhelming evidence, seemed indifferent to the pain he had caused. His demeanor in court was chilling. He didn't show the slightest sign of guilt or regret. His answers to questions were detached, as though he were talking about someone else's crimes. He had been caught. He had confessed. But he had no reason to apologize. This, perhaps, was the most disturbing thing of all. Kemper's lack of remorse was not just a sign of his disconnection from reality, it was a terrifying glimpse into the mind of a serial killer who had no emotional attachment to his actions. He had killed, dismembered, and disposed of bodies without hesitation, without guilt, and without remorse. And in the courtroom, he sat like a man discussing a business transaction. News outlets across the country were stunned by Kemper's trial. His complete lack of emotion, coupled with his chilling calmness, left everyone questioning the nature of his crime. How could someone who had killed so violently and so methodically be so composed, so articulate, so normal? The unsettling reality was clear. Ed Kemper was not just a killer. He was a predator who had learned how to blend into society, to become